Hello, and welcome to the lifestyle panel for the Big Unlock. I hope everyone's safe and stay safe during these interesting times. My name is Michael Farrow. I will be your moderator for this panel. We want to make the best use of time. So we have 4 10-minute presentations by our awesome panelists. Then we follow that with the Q&A. Please feel free to use the Zoom feature to submit your questions. And if you would like a specific panelist to answer that, please indicate so as well. With that said, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have Alex Stapp, Director of Technology Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute, Alexandra Hilker, Strategic Director at Brand Juice, Mike Courtney, Founder and CEO at Aperio Insights, and Marshall Kosloff, Director of Outreach and Media at Lincoln Network. With that said, we are going to have our first presentation with Alex Stapp. Alex, please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. Let me just get the screen share going here. 1 second. Sorry about that. Yes, I think I have the security setting fixed. All right, we're going to the PowerPoint. Share that screen. View. Slideshow. All right, should be good. Are we doing good? All right.
Fantastic.
Great.
Yes, please go ahead.
So I like to think about different markets by just looking at charts. I think charts tell stories in a way that other pieces of information don't quite capture. So for my presentation, I'm going to keep it pretty simple and just share some of the favorite charts I've seen related to e-commerce over the last couple months. So I think we've all heard that during the COVID pandemic that there's been a spike in e-commerce. And so people are saying that this has accelerated a trend that's already been happening over time, that there's been an increase in share of total retail sales that go to e-commerce, about 15% back in 2015, now up to around 25%. But I think this is actually somewhat of an illusion, the magnitude of increase we've seen in the last couple months, because if you see, it's actually more about the denominator. So it's actually the fact that physical retail sales have shrunk so quickly that actually online sales have not increased much. They've just stayed kind of the same, but as a share of total retail, they've gone up because physical retail has kind of collapsed, obviously, amid the pandemic. And so another way you can look at this is you can look at credit card sales data. So you can look at, this is Chase consumer card spending, by whether there's a physical card present, meaning it's an in-person purchase, or there's no card present, meaning it's likely an online purchase. As you can see from this chart, card not present or online purchases have pretty much recovered back to their pre-crisis rate already, but physical purchases are still down more than 30%. And so I think this tells us the story that yes, online sales can make up somewhat of the slack during the crisis, but they can't fully accommodate the overall collapse in consumer spending. Another kind of narrative that we see during the crisis is that Amazon is more dominant than ever. People often point to its stock price as evidence of that. And that's true, as you can see by this year-to-date performance for Amazon. The stock is up about 25%. The company's worth more than $1 trillion. So of course it is a big player, the biggest in e-commerce. But I think that kind of obscures the reality in terms of market shares, which when you look at other data, you can see that Amazon's market share has actually decreased during the crisis. So previously they were getting about 40% of all e-commerce sales were controlled by Amazon. Now it's down to 35%. And that's kind of hard for people to understand, like how can the stock price be up, but the market share number is down? And I think it's because Amazon has committed itself to prioritizing essential goods during the crisis. So, toilet paper, Kleenex, that sort of stuff. That's low value products. And a lot of the high value products that aren't seen as essential goods have been going to other retailers. And so Amazon is actually losing market share during the crisis. And Amazon's trying to cope with overwhelming demand. And so their shipping times have slowed down. So that forces consumers to look elsewhere in the market. And so we can kind of compare Amazon's performance to other players. So as you can see here, Target and Walmart are seeing much greater growth than Amazon is on a percentage basis. So these are year-over-year sales numbers. So absolutely explosive growth for Target in their e-commerce division, and Walmart as well. And Amazon's up significantly, but not nearly as much. And so that tells us is that over time, if these rate of change continue to proceed at anything remotely close to this pace, they're going to catch up to Amazon in terms of market share. And then from the next slide, a company that's kind of under discussed in e-commerce and in consumer spending habits is Shopify. So this is an $80 billion Canadian company. But the reason it's not discussed is because they don't have a front-facing consumer interface. So Shopify actually supports small and medium-sized businesses to do their own business online. So Shopify provides the back-end functionality. So when you go to a mom and pop shop, their direct website, not on Amazon, not on anywhere else, Shopify is running in the background to make that business function. And so as you can see by their stock price, this is a booming business. I think they're kind of the underrated threat to Amazon in the long run, because merchants building their own websites for their customers and being supported by a tech vendor like Shopify, I think is a really underrated trend. My primary area I work on is antitrust. And so whenever we talk about market shares, the immediate question is, should the government break up Amazon, or is this a threat or a problem? I think it's really interesting to talk about how market share numbers change based on what market you're looking at. So we think of Amazon as having both first-party sales when you're buying from Amazon and Amazon is the retailer, or you're buying from the third-party marketplace, Amazon Marketplace, where you're buying from another retailer. When you put those things all together, in total, Amazon has about 35% of the e-commerce market, which is significant, but not a monopoly in the way that people often throw that term around, saying Amazon has monopolized e-commerce. But then when you broaden that out to the total retail market, including physical sales, Amazon only has about 5% of that market. That really changes the picture in terms of Amazon's dominance and how you think about the problem. Another trend that I keep my eye on is grocery sale deliveries online. So Instacart is dominating that market. Here again, we see year-over-year percentage increases. Instacart's running away with that market. And I think this is one of those trends that will probably stick after the crisis. A lot will go back to how it used to be. But I think people have realized, like, the fees are small or zero to get groceries delivered. It's easier than shopping myself. Even if I don't need to stay home, why not get groceries delivered? I think will be kind of a consumer habit that sticks for the long run. Another one that I think is really interesting is Uber. Luckily had diversified its business somewhat away from just ride hailing. They obviously have their Uber Eats division. A lot of people are getting meals delivered during the crisis. So while their rides division has collapsed, as you can see in this chart in terms of sales, now they make more money off of Uber Eats than they do on ride hailing. So it's interesting to see how businesses with diverse revenue streams can cope with the crisis. And then I've done a lot of work on FDA reform and the importance of PPE production. And I was at first hesitant or skeptical that we could actually increase production quickly enough for things like face masks. But this data from Etsy is actually really reassuring, because mom and pop merchants and creators went on Etsy and saw the need and the demand for face masks, and they met that demand. 17% of all gross merchandise sales on Etsy in April were for face masks, which is kind of astonishing. I think that's a great example of a smaller platform like Etsy meeting a demand that previously wasn't there. And then obviously the market is shifting towards electronics as well. So we're on a Zoom call right now. We have computers, video, audio equipment. Everyone's trying to upgrade to have a good work from home experience or a remote learning experience. And as you can see, year over year, sales of electronics are also booming. And then lastly, for my last chart, I think there's a narrative out there that the big tech companies are bigger than ever, that Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, and Facebook are a huge portion of the market, and their dominance can never be stopped. The chart on the left you see was in the New York Times recently, showing that they now make up 20% of the entire S&P 500. The problem with that New York Times chart on the left is that it didn't go back far enough, I think, to give you the relevant historical context. The chart on the right goes back to 1960, and as you can see, 5 companies being 20% of the S&P 500 is not a historical anomaly. In the early 1960s, the top 5 companies made up 30% of the market. So big companies have been big for a while, and I think while the big 5 are big, it's not a historical outlier by any means. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Since we are slightly ahead of time, I have a question that came up. If hypothetically Amazon didn't exist today, what company would you think would have taken its place and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think probably it's something like Walmart or Target. I think Shopify was inevitable to come around on the later end when small merchants realized, like, I don't necessarily want to be on a big platform. I want to control the user experience. I want to design the website, control the consumer's experience from the landing page all the way through to order fulfillment. But I think in the early days, it made sense for big retailers with the resources to build a big platform and have especially the distribution network of having warehouses and stores throughout the country to quickly deliver products to consumers. I think that was almost impossible to beat. So if it wasn't Amazon, it was gonna be Walmart or Target. And also the best evidence of this is that Target, for the first decade, for the 2000s, outsourced its online division to Amazon, actually. So if Amazon hadn't been there to fulfill Target orders, I think Target would have been forced to build their own. And that's eventually what they did. So they ended up building their own platform because they wanted that independence and control. But I think that timeline would have moved up.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you, Alec. So we are moving to the next presentation. Alexandra, you're next.
All right. Let me just pull this up real quick. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alexandra Hilder, and I work with Brand Juice. We are a brand strategy and design agency that has worked with leading brands across consumer packaged goods, healthcare, technology, and anything from startups to Fortune 100s for about 20 years now. And at Brand Juice, our practice of futuring and trend forecasting is really pivotal to capturing some of those emerging insights that can help brands not only future-proof their offering, but make some of those micro adjustments and grow along with the customer. So some of the ways that we think about trends are through the realm of these two, what we would call these polarities of change. So on one hand, we have a lot of these expanding environments. So think about those traditional categories that are serving the greatest need. And especially when we think to the time of coronavirus, we have these legacy companies such as General Mills, Campbell's, that have come in and are serving a broad need for some of these classic or comfort foods that people have turned to during these times of uncertainty. And then also on the expanding front, there are some of those areas that we know have been growing for some time, but this is really the tipping point for adoption. So if we think to telehealth, or as Alec mentioned, delivery groceries, these types of things that are quickly becoming adopted and, as we can see, are going to become cemented in behavior for some time to come. And then on the flip side, we have contracting environments. And one of those areas that we've really had our eye on is thinking through traditional models that have been really slow to change. So thinking big department stores who have been a little bit more slow to adopt technologies, or even rethinking their channel of delivery altogether. So throughout some of these trend slides that I'm going to take you through, we want to think through how there are those areas of expansion versus contraction. So one of the first trends is around digitizing humanity. And the more that we've been forced to live in isolation, it's pushing brands in turn to create more connected emotional experiences digitally. And a way that we see brands beginning to create some of those touch points is through utilizing virtual companions or these brand avatars to bring some of that personality to life. And one example, just to kind of think through how is this tangibly coming forward, we've looked at skincare brands such as SK-II. They recently launched Yumi, and Yumi is an autonomously functioning, more or less a chatbot that comes to life and has her own personality. She takes all of the data that consumers give her from anything around their preferences, their favorite products, but also taking into account the factors of their environment that make up their overall skincare routine. And she's able to have a fully fledged conversation with the consumer. So just some really interesting ways that we see brands thinking through how we can create some of those touch points in lieu of that face-to-face connection. And then another area that I think we've all been thinking on for some time now, is around this the shift towards sustainability. And the pandemic is one of those very interesting anomalies where consumers have quite often been really avoiding some of those sustainable types of practices, or it's not something that has been quickly adopted. But I'm sure everyone can attest to the fact that we've seen pollution around the globe decreasing, and just awakening to this idea that we could do a lot more with a lot less. And in response to that, the secondhand industry is booming, specifically looking to the secondhand clothing market. It's on track to reach sales of about $43 billion by 2022. And this is really thanks in part to community-centric types of platforms, that it's not just a space to purchase, but it's a space that does continue to cement some of those interactions and connection through a community. And then also on the topic of sustainability, food waste is something that we know continues to be a global issue. And while we know that fresh groceries will still be around, this time period that we're living through is pushing consumers to adopt more and more shelf-stable products, or shifting towards that frozen market. One example that we've seen showing a lot of growth, Daily Harvest is one frozen food subscription service, and they've seen a spike in sales since the onset of the pandemic, and it looks like they are beating their customer acquisition target on an average about 70% per day. So really, this is about nudging us to consider how we can build much more resilience into our food systems in order to be sure that we're able to deliver food to our communities. And then another area that we wanted to touch on is around urgent innovation that is happening in the healthcare space. So beyond just the pandemic, chronic illnesses around the globe are putting a significant strain on systems. And with that, there's this opportunity to have smaller, more nimble players enter the space to be able to bring solutions to the forefront much more quickly. One area that we're looking towards is pharmaceuticals, and that this is a space where there's a lot of untapped white space for startups to be able to not only generate awareness, but they're being taken much more seriously in a time where non-traditional solutions are really some of the best routes. One example that we've been looking to is Benevolent AI, and this is a company out of the UK that is using their AI platform to mine already existing solutions that are in the marketplace, and being able to use that autonomous capability to cross-reference how a drug might be able to treat this specific condition. And then also on the other side, thinking about some of these fringe technologies that we've had at our disposal for some time, but the pandemic has really pushed these into the forefront. So I think telehealth is one area that everyone's seen has become rapidly adopted. But beyond that, we're seeing a quick adoption of robotics. So thinking around anything from indoor to outdoor sanitizing of environments, all the way to delivering goods to homebound patients. Robots are one way that we see being able to bridge this gap, especially in times of crisis in this way, and we see those continuing to grow. Also on the topic of health, we're looking towards the fact that senior populations have really been thrust into the spotlight in terms of having just this gap in solutions that really help them maintain health. One of the areas that we're seeing is in senior living centers, and this is a model that is prime for disruption, going beyond just putting a roof over an aging population's heads. We expect to see a shift towards much more healthcare-based types of senior living centers that are really holding to much higher standards of compliance in order to keep those populations safe. And thinking around, again, some of these underserved populations, coronavirus has put a lot of chronic illnesses such as heart disease and diabetes into the spotlight. And with that in mind, we're seeing companies such as nutrition providers coming up with plans that are much more dedicated to their specific health challenges. So as a whole, we can expect to see many more connected systems that are designed, that they're not just point solutions anymore, but taking into account the 360-degree view of the patient at large and what their needs are. And then looking ahead to retail, I think Alec captured a lot of these insights really well. First and foremost, around the fact that e-commerce has been disrupting the way that we purchase for some time now. But we see the fact that these types of ways of getting groceries, getting a lot of those key services and goods that we need, being able to have them delivered to our door without a lot of extra cost. So that's something that we see continuing. Thinking to the in-store experience, especially at grocery, we expect to see mobile payments becoming the norm and potentially doing away with the checkout altogether. So as we think to what the grocery store experience might look like in the future, this is really going to push grocery chains to build much more experiential offerings, because we're going to need to give consumers a reason to come into the store. So expect a lot of change on that side. And then just the consolidation of commerce. As we've seen, the pandemic has pushed a lot of smaller retailers to go out of business. And again, this is just driving more of that consolidation towards those big channels, such as those Costco's, but also thinking as Amazon as that go-to resource. So just a couple of implications that I wanted to leave you with based on these trends. There's a silver lining, if there is a silver lining, I should say, to the pandemic. It's the fact that we have this opportunity for challenger brands to come in and potentially disrupt some of the bigger players in the space. And this is really where it'll be interesting to see who has been dedicated, having a dedicated effort to tracking the data in order to prove efficacy of these non-traditional methods. Second, we can expect to see new products that are, again, targeting some of these underserved populations that for some time have not been getting even the marketing or the product offerings to meet their specific needs, especially as we think to senior populations, and again, those who are facing chronic illness. And then lastly, we expect to see a lot more diversification happening, especially as retail brands who once rested on singular products to carry them forward. We're going to see a lot more of that diversification in order to be able to disrupt some of these events that we see not being over anytime soon. So one of the areas that I think we just wanted to hit home on is the fact that during this time of ups and downs in terms of the products that we have at our disposal, consumers have been forced to trial new offerings that they never would have considered before. And with that in mind, we have this new frontier of reaching consumers, and they're much more open-minded than they've ever been before. So this is a great opportunity for brands to rethink their target audiences and dig a little bit deeper to understand what are some of those shifts that they can make to reach them where they're at and continue to grow with them in the process.
Thank you, Alexandra. I have a question for you. How do you foresee pandemics such as COVID-19 affecting retail brands, such as beauty products or even some technology products that are heavily dependent on person-to-person marketing?
Mm-hmm. So I think, as we touched on, one of those ways is creating hyper-personalized experiences. And I think we all know that this has been a trend for some time, but this is going the extra mile in terms of customer service, anything from utilizing texting, even phone calls to create better relationships with customers. But from a digital perspective, thinking back to the example of creating avatars or much more robust chatbot experiences in a way that digs deeper into the profile of that individual consumer. So we expect to see some type of push and pull in terms of what is that level of personal information that we're willing to share as consumers. But ultimately, we're seeing this trend that if the ends justify the means of giving up some of our personal data, that consumers are much more willing to do so. So just comes down to creating those experiences that speak to what the specific needs are, but also aligning the brand to the values that your audience cares about.
Yeah, but I mean, if it's a more on the person-to-person type of marketing, let's say brands like Chanel, I didn't want to name a specific one, that are heavily marketed in the shopping malls or from one person marketing it to another person. Now, if the pandemics like this happen on a recurring basis, or it takes a much longer time, how do you think those companies need to shift the focus in order to be able to still market their product?
Mm-hmm. And again, I think that's where we see shifting what that looks like from potentially going away from the channel of the large department store to rethinking pop-ups and how they can forge unlikely partnerships. So for a long time, we've seen brands really playing in their area of focus, but with this emergence of more of this complete lifestyle approach to how we market brands, we could see a brand such as Chanel creating a partnership with, say, a West Elm, but really doing it in a way that is value centric, so that you're not delineating or getting too far away from the equities of the brand. But from that sense, I think we see both the in-person delivery changing. So again, those pop-ups and whatnot, but also how can you reach people through storytelling via social media and just taking things a layer deeper in order to create an emotional connection.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alexandra. So with that said, we are moving to the next presentation. Marshall, you have the floor.
Hey, everyone. You're just going to be looking at me and not a presentation, so that's all right. So I work for the Lincoln Network. We are based in Silicon Valley in DC, and what we're really focused on is how, and this is sort of our tagline, but how can we sort of make the future happen faster? So we're focused on sort of the broader picture that conversations about technology, innovation, and policy reform we sort of focus on. So this discussion of supply chains and how that affects consumers is actually right up our alley, because we're really focused on the sort of like building conversation that Marc Andreessen's essay, a famous Silicon Valley venture capitalist, 2 months ago sort of set out. And so before I jump in, I think it's really important to give some sort of context on Marc Andreessen's work. In 2011, he wrote a really famous op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that was called "Software is Eating the World." And it basically sort of summed up the way that technology and the investment space would look out for the next 10 years. So basically the point of the essay was, if you're looking for opportunities, if you're looking for these unlocks, focus on how you could leverage software to upend old industries, right? So if you're Uber made sense in this sense, because if you want to see how you could change taxis, like leverage software. Airbnb, same thing of hotels, on and on and on and on. Stripe with payments. That was the focus of the 2010s. So the purpose of his Time to Build essay that he wrote last month was really focused on this post-COVID-19 world, where if we're looking at what happened in February and March, we weren't lamenting the fact that we didn't have software and technologies like Zoom. Actually, in a bunch of different ways, that software actually worked really well. The problem we had was that our supply chains were overly reliant on a country such as China, which, separate from the political conversations there was this humongous problem with the coronavirus itself. And I think a key really important point here is that 51,000 international companies have their direct supply chain originate in Wuhan. So a situation where we're sort of dependent on that sort of supply chain is obviously one where there'll be lots of volatile experiences. So the point of Andreessen's essay is that in the 2020s, if we focus on software, sort of, bits and bytes in the 2010s, in the 2020s, we need to focus on how can we actually make resilient supply chains? How can we actually make it so that our in-person live experiences are resilient ones that can sort of focus on? So the good news, bad news on the supply chain conversation when it comes to firms such as Amazon, places such as Walmart, is it's not as if those 51,000 suppliers are going to come home. Like the reality is that the supply chain, when it comes to legacy and sort of conventional goods, everything from Nike sneakers to sort of basic domestic goods like you pick out cheap at Walmart, it doesn't make much sense to sort of reshore those jobs back to the United States. So if you're thinking about how you should be approaching your supply chain security, thinking that you're just going to simply move back those 51,000 sort of production capacities back to the US doesn't really make any sense, especially given the fact that a lot of the opportunity moving forward is actually getting into the Chinese market. So part of the reason why you're sourcing a lot of goods in Wuhan isn't simply because of the fact that the labor and the land outputs are cheap. You're doing that because you actually want to get access to this massively growing Chinese market. So the trend that you're going to see isn't firms reshoring themselves away from China, despite the controversy with the CCP, despite the controversy with the actual virus, because they're still going to want to get access to those emerging markets. And I think part of the way that we discuss these things, part of the thing that's sort of like that's difficult about this conversation is that our rhetoric around supply chains is sort of centered in sort of like the 1950s, or even sort of like the first industrial revolution in the 19th century. As in, there's no such thing as a world where you're going to have one country that's the factory of the world, right? You're not going to see a Great Britain in the 1850s producing all the bicycles that everyone buys. You're not going to see a post-World War II United States that's capable of producing all these goods. What we could see instead, though, is a world where supply chains become much more regional. So if you're looking to get access to the American market, if you're Walmart and you're Amazon or you're Target and you don't want to have there be a supply chain interruption, if you're concerned that there's a trade war between China and the United States and you're worried about tariffs, what would make more sense rather than just reshoring everything that you're doing is keep your goods that are for the Chinese market in China. But if you're trying to serve the North American market, you should reshore factories that actually produce for those markets there. So the trend that we could see and the opportunity when it comes to building is focusing on serving consumers where they are. Because sort of the key and the most important part of this talk is that there are humongous opportunities when it comes to robotics, automation, artificial intelligence, 3D printing. And what this sort of means is that we're focusing beyond sort of like generic goods or sort of like legacy goods, sort of like sneakers, and we're talking more about these future-centric ones. When we're focusing on these new technologies that are more 21st century, obviously, we could be thinking about how is it that, in a world where supply chains are focused more on these advanced products, it doesn't really matter if the goods could be produced cheaply in China or they could be produced cheaply in Bangladesh. What actually is going to become much more important in this context is, can a factory actually leverage the robotics, the automation, the AI, the printing? That's the sort of thing where there could be an opportunity. So I think anyone who's thinking from a sort of consumer or manufacturing perspective should be thinking, I'm not going to have an opportunity to sort of reshore our sneaker supply or reshore, I'm sure we all saw there was this massive shortage in exercise equipment. That's not going to be the opportunity as much. The opportunity is going to be these 21st century technologies. They're not going to be out producing these things cheaply. They're going to be out producing these things the most effectively. And to finish up really, if you look at the U.S. Right now, like we're only the fourth largest robotics installer in the world, despite the fact that we have the #1 consumer market in the world. Obviously, the Chinese market is growing, but still the U.S. punches far above its weight from the perspective of actual population. So I think it's really important to focus, if you're a big chain, if you're sort of focused on these sort of robotics and manufacturing technologies, what advanced products can I build that will make sense within this sort of world where what's key isn't like how cheap the land is or how cheap the labor is, and when the main factor that matters is how is like the road infrastructure, how is the technology, are you sort of able to do those things? So I'd say the real sort of takeaway is that there's this massive opportunity in these advanced technologies, but that being said, we shouldn't expect the world to sort of pivot from sort of Chinese manufacturing simply because of all the controversies that we saw during the coronavirus.
Thank you, Marshall. So in regarding to that, so these advanced technologies that you foresee, there is a significant demand for the next years to come. Do you foresee any of those demand be reversed if for example, COVID-19 vaccine is developed earlier than expected?
Yeah, so the thing is that, and so just to clarify the last part, so if coronavirus sort of if we get sort of a resurgence of coronavirus in the fall or something, I think part of the issue is that these sort of trends, I say, are inevitable regardless of what happens with COVID-19. I think the good line, this is not my line, but I think it's useful for thinking about how COVID will or won't change the world. It's not as if COVID is creating anything new. It's just sort of accelerating trends that are already there. So there already was this discussion about a trade war with China as relates to American manufacturing ever since the new administration came in. But COVID-19 just furthered that conversation, but in a couple of different ways. It made that conversation much less partisan. So now it made it so that we're just going to focus on that more. So I think that the opportunity for focusing on advanced manufacturing is always going to be there, regardless of whether or not COVID comes back. And I think that, this is more a matter of maybe that means we delay things. Maybe that means there isn't as much demand there, but there's still going to be a space in 2022, 2023 to fill regardless of a vaccine.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Marshall. Very useful. So with that said, we're going to move to the last presenter. Mike Courtney, you have the floor.
Great. Can you see slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm Mike Courtney. I'm a researcher and futurist, and here's some thoughts from the perspective of both. So essentially, as a futurist, we often think in terms of systems, that if I change one aspect of the world we live in, it has some impact on other systems, on other aspects of the world. The other thing we think of, and some of you might be familiar with daters for archetypes of change, that there are patterns of change. Things like whether things continue as normal, whether there's a collapse, new equilibrium, transformation. And these are useful frameworks for us to think about, especially when things like COVID come about. So continuation is one of the ones where this is often called the no change future. And this is almost the least likely option because things always change. Even if there's not a pandemic, even if there's not something major happening, things are continually shifting. And in a continuation archetype, we have to keep in mind that things like, let's say, spiritual rituals or, maybe celebrating birthdays and anniversaries. You may not go to the mall or you may not go out to dinner because of a pandemic, but you'll still celebrate that event. Those things will continue regardless of the other things around you. Collapse. Collapse is something that, again, is a natural part of the cycles we live in. And sometimes that's not always a bad thing. You get some of the things our parents did or, shag carpet, maybe not a bad thing that collapsed and that went away. Other collapse might be things like the collapse of film cameras or the collapse of certain political ideologies in the past. And again, it's a normal pattern of change. Another one, new equilibrium. This starts to get into a little bit more of, okay, we're going to take the way things did and we're going to sort of change it enough to make it different, but there's still some of the old world there. Tylenol tampering. If you remember back in the day when some people did some things with Tylenol on the shelf and created issues and harmed people. And you thought for a period of time, well, maybe we'll never be able to buy something off the shelf. It'll always have to be handed to us. Well, they figured out how to put a little safety seal on it. And lo and behold, that just became the standard that we live with now. Same thing with post-airport security in terms of post 9/11. Again, just new equilibrium. Transformation, all sorts of things that we've seen certainly accelerating in the last 10 or 20 years in terms of digital communications, internet, but even things like the horseless buggy that eventually was transformed into a whole different type of transportation. This brings us to something that we like to call timeless needs. When we think about the future, very often people will get really wrapped up into, well, hey, in the future, am I gonna have 6 presets on my stereo or 7? What's it gonna be? It's like, well, you might not have presets. You might not have a stereo. You might not have a CD player. Like, wait. And the timeless need in that case might be, well, I'll still have entertainment. I might not have presets. Timeless needs are simply things we've done in the past, we do now, and we will do them in the future. They are timeless. Let me give you an example. Cleaning your home. Even if you went back 200-300 years, and let's say we're living in a very different environment in that period of time, you still had some version of cleaning your home. And now you didn't have the same technologies you do today. And then eventually technology came into being and they said, hey, now I can clean the house and I've got a broom that was meant to sweep the floor. Or I'm going to clean the house later and now we have a vacuum that's meant to clean the floor. In the future, even today, maybe we have robots that are going to do more and more of it. Timeless need was cleaning the home. The technology layer is how we resolve it, how we do those things. There's certain things that are timeless, like clean and odor-free. What it meant to our ancestors to be clean and odor-free probably meant very different things than what it means today and what it'll mean in the future. There's all sorts of timeless needs. Almost you can map it to Maslow in terms of the things that we care about and how that maps out to our world. This is an example of what we did for a learning environment in school, the things that you would want in a school. Again, we probably wanted them back in the single room schoolhouse days. We want them today, and we'll want them in the future. How we achieve them will change. So at the end of the day, there are changing values at play right now. The image here, I think some of you may have seen on social media where, hey, instead of delivering a bouquet of roses, I'm gonna deliver a bouquet of toilet paper. At the end of the day, human needs are basically stable, but what we value can change dramatically. And this is gonna lead to lots of innovation. Now, innovation in all sorts of areas in both our homes and the retail environments we visit. The idea of having a sink near the urinal in the past might have been so you can clean up after. Now it might be, let's wash my hands before. In the past, seeing an image like this of everybody out watching a game in a bar, it might have been, hey, that looks like fun. Today, that means like, that feels like anxiety. There's too many people, where's the masks? In the future, we might want, even once we have a vaccine, even once things are under control in terms of health-wise, we may still trend towards, okay, maybe I want something with a little less busy, a little more room between me and the other people. We're still going to want to go to the malls and have experiences and go to high-end hotels and restaurants and things, but those high-end environments might look a little different. You might actually have a washroom, literally a sink at the entrance to a mall or a store or a venue that you'd never expect to have before. Typically the sink, well, that's in the restroom, that's in the back towards the left, and look for the sign. You might have those kind of things in front and center today. Another thing is, imagine in the future when you build a new home. If you're building a luxury home, in the past few years, it was really common to put in a media room. It cost some money, but it was something you could use, something that was a nice to have thing. Maybe in the future, if you had to decide between that and something else, you might actually choose to have a guest room that has some gear that makes it easier if you have to quarantine yourself or somebody's ill and they need more of almost a medical environment and be able to telehealth back and forth, but have actual medical gear in your home beyond what a thermometer that your parents always had as a kid. These days, you might have all sorts of medical gear, and it might be the standard in the future. What we dress like and how those things communicate who we are has always been a part of society. Our watches, our clothes, and now in the world of Zoom, maybe some of those things don't matter anymore. What's it going to be like to be a shoe manufacturer in the world of everybody being on Zoom and working from home? Will shoes matter? Will socks matter? Maybe it's just going to be jackets and shirts. The other things that are going to happen, we've all seen the work from home. We're getting to know who else is in the office at home, getting to know other things about our coworkers. And in the future, those friends of ours from home might actually make it into the work environment, even if we don't live or don't work in a startup. That I think it's going to become more natural that we have this blending of home and work, personal and work, and not only in between meetings or during a meeting, maybe answering a child's question about homework, but maybe in the future, again, those children might come into the workplace and it might not look as weird as it might look today to say, so-and-so has their kid here, they're in a meeting, yeah, that's okay. They're going to doodle on the wall and that's okay. Same thing about travel, that this looks like what could be a nice Airbnb somewhere. You say, well, it looks like a nice luxury place. I can rent it for the family, go on vacation, but we may value other things that also protect us in the future. We may say, well, I also want the Airbnb that if something happens, I can really be protected in a really secure way. We may say, I don't want just the place by the beach. I want the place by the beach that can be a bunker if I need it to be. Maybe the places that we want to stay in the future, in addition to a view, say, I want a view like this as well. I want to make sure that if I get caught somewhere and something happens and I have to hunker down, they've got the kind of things that are going to keep me comfortable for a while. We might travel differently. We might decide to do different kinds of trips with our friends, maybe go places that don't have as many people around, or the people that are around, or the people that we know and our friends and family, and still have meaningful experiences. Even things like cruise lines in the future may change. Today, you'd probably be hard pressed to get many people to sign up for a cruise given the things that have happened the last couple of months. But in the future, a lot can change. And cruise ships might become one of the safest places you could be. At the end of the day, a futurist is all about thinking about the future, looking at the future. And the easy way to understand what foresight is just this three things: hindsight, insight, foresight. Hindsight's easiest, looking at the past. Insight looks at today. Foresight simply looks at the future. It is more than just creativity. It is really you being very methodical, very planned and procedural in terms of all the different interactions that could happen and what it might mean to your business. Understanding what drives the changes to give you a roadmap of those leverage points and allow you to amplify your impact with enough time. Paying attention gives you time, time gives you options. So that's what we got. And I'll stop share.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mike. I have two questions for you. One is how far out should we look when we consider the future?
Sure. So typically when in the past, when we do foresight work, we typically look out 10 or 15 years because it took that many years to encompass the amount of change that was really meaningful for most organizations to try to wrestle with. Right now, we're looking at 10 or 15 months. Because there's so much change that could happen and we believe will happen in the next year to year and a half, that the same tools you would typically use to look out a decade or more are really useful to look out the next year, year and a half.
Perfect. The second question is how do you foresee intimate and friendship moments such as dating, Father's Day, Mother's Day, and so forth be affected in the future with or without pandemics like COVID-19?
And that's one of the interesting things, and I think we've all seen, again, on social media and the news, you know, how difficult it has been to have those special moments and keep in contact with loved ones because of the pandemic. And the human nature, the human desire, that timeless need to connect with people in a certain way, I have no doubt that we're going to learn different ways to communicate, different ways to be in touch, and try to replicate that closeness, replicate being in touch and being there for special moments, even if in certain times it is different. Who would have thought, if you could have convinced your parents, you know, when you were growing up, you know, 20, 30 years ago, hey, you know, someday it'll still be meaningful to call and say hello or wish somebody happy birthday without being in person. And they'll say, but the phone's not the same. And today, a lot of great things can happen over video and happen with technology. Robotics is going to play a role. I think there's, again, we're going to innovate and find new ways to get close and communicate and express the things that we've always wanted to express, even if we can't be there in person.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate it. All right. So with our four panelists have completed their presentation, we are going to audience Q&A. We have about 5 minutes roughly. So I should be able to, we should be able to get about 2 or 3 questions. Alexandra, your question, there's 2 questions for you. The first one is, what are the changes that brands need to be making now in order to survive on the short and long-term basis?
So I think just to echo what Mike was speaking to, the fact that we've never seen such rapid change before. And one of the ways that when brands used to think about the way that you collect insights and get to understand your target consumer, this is something that we see being much more real-time and conducting ongoing research touch points, especially as we see brands speaking to audiences such as Gen Z. There's this new shift towards letting the customer really drive what the brand experience looks like, even what the product offering is. So from that standpoint, we see that being kind of a non-negotiable to be conducting more of that real-time insight. I think another area that has been brewing for some time is just around creating much more community-driven storytelling. So how do we reach consumers in a way that does create that emotional connection? And I think one of those areas that is a complex space for brands is around how do you get involved on so many of these very emotional topics. Just thinking through from one crisis to the next, it's really about aligning your brand to those specific values. So I think we will see brands just investing a lot more in terms of what does their advertising strategy look like, and how do they bring the consumer into that storytelling experience. And then I think lastly, as we've all touched on, the fact that brands are going to need to continue to innovate what the offering looks like. As we've seen, industries that were really bedrock to how we live our lives have been disrupted and really brought to their knees. So through that diversification of those revenue streams, that they'll be able to hopefully be able to ride out the next type of coronavirus.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We are slightly short on time, so I want to give a chance to other panelists. If you have more time, I'll come back to you with the second question, Alexandra. Thank you. Marshall, I have a question for you. It appears that the smaller countries such as Germany, South Korea, and Taiwan have been able to better manage the pandemics, both on the industrial side and containing the virus overall. Do you foresee the world's frontrunners, such as United States, China, and Russia, lose their superpower for pandemics such as, if pandemics such as COVID-19 occur more often?
So I think part of the thing here is short-term versus long-term. I think one should be bullish on the US, one should be bullish on China, because at the end of the day, they have these assets, population strength, manufacturing capacity, like the US, like despite everything, still has the best educational system in the world. So I think long term, I don't think the US or China for that matter are going to be knocked off by their poor initial responses. And the thing too is that what's been good about the current situation is when Singapore, South Korea, Germany, when they handle their outbreaks well, we could obviously learn lessons from that. And it's hard to sort of do that in the short term, but I think long term, especially when we could sort of look at sort of what happened when we compare the responses of places like Sweden to the UK, to the US, to Singapore, we're going to get takeaways there. So like, once again, the US and China are the places that are best able, frankly, to leverage that. I mean, I think China has a lot of practice in restarting a manufacturing sector after everything that just happened, and that's a strength.
Thank you. Alec, we have the next question for you. If we assume that the pandemics like COVID-19 become worse in both severity and frequency, do you foresee a rise in more companies with decentralized distribution models such as eBay or Etsy?
Yeah, I think that's a safe prediction, and the main reason is because it's more responsive to uncertainty in consumer and variations in consumer demand. And I think you see this as an issue with Amazon, and Amazon Marketplace is now bigger than Amazon the retailer, where Amazon's the direct taking control of inventory and actually selling it to the customer. The marketplace, where small merchants make decentralized decisions about what to inventory, where to keep, which warehouse to keep it in, and how to price it. Those are all independent decisions. And so if you think about like, what's a better response to a crisis? Is it the command and control centralized model, or is it the bottom up decentralized non-hierarchical model? And I think pretty clearly, because there's so rapid change and the need to aggregate information quickly, the decentralized model that depends mostly on price signals is the better approach. And so that's why platforms like Amazon, they can be huge companies, but if you depended on Amazon just as a central player, it would kind of fall apart in a crisis, and it did in many ways. But the decentralized marketplace approach is actually much more resilient.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, we are right on time. I would like to thank everyone who has been involved in creating this webinar, including but not limited to our beloved panelists, attendees, and of course the sponsors. I wish everyone a safe year, and hopefully we can get we can conform to the new norm as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.